we will go ahead and kick this thing off. We wanted to start off just by saying, thank you for everyone that's joining. We really strategically gathered this attendee group together in efforts to tailor our discussion to relevant topics directly impacting how to manage the transition back into the workplace. The two main questions that everyone's really been asking us lately is, how do we bring people back to work? And what's going to be changing about the workplace? The million-dollar questions, right? So we've collected this group of expert panelists to help walk us through different perspectives on how these workplaces will evolve. So with that, I would like to introduce Miss Lauren Whitney. She is a registered interior designer and an expert in workplace wellness. She's a VP here on our interiors team and has some great perspectives on well views. So thank you, Lauren, for joining us.
Thanks. Good morning, Jacqueline.
Good morning. Next, we have Miss Emily Strain. She is a registered interior designer and a VP of our Director Workplace Strategy. She focuses a lot on change management and has some really great perspectives and insights, especially on how we can be transitioning people back to the workplace. So I'll be picking your brain a lot today, Emily. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks. Miss sitting next to you, Jacqueline.
I know. I'm virtually there with you. Next on the panel, we have Miss Samantha Flores. She is an architect and a senior associate here at Corgan. She also spearheads our Hugo Research and Development Department, which is a new leg that we've just kind of kicked off recently at Corgan. And so we'll get into the weeds of what she's been working on and how that translates into our designs in the future. So welcome, Miss Samantha.
Thanks for having me.
Next on the panel, we have Chris Nicholas. He's an architect and VP on our healthcare team. So certainly has a lot of popularity these days as far as picking your brain on different approaches to how the healthcare can translate into the workplace and some of the strategies that we're using there. So thank you, Chris, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Jacqueline. This should be a fun discussion.
Yes, I'm excited. And last but not least, we have Mr. Matt Mcdonald, architect and principal on our commercial team. So he's got certainly some great opinions and perspectives on how this transition is going to be making it shift from a built perspective. And we're excited to have you, Matt. So thanks for joining.
Good morning. Excited to be here.
And lastly, my name is Jacqueline Hunter. I'm a registered interior designer and associate on the interiors team, so focusing as a design manager. So just kind of here to be a fly on the wall and take in all of the good information that these experts have to give to us. So a couple of housekeeping items. Although we do have the attendees muted, we want to encourage you guys to submit any sort of questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And we'll be sure to do our best and leave some space to integrate these throughout the conversation. Okay, let me shift gears here. Okay, sorry guys, I'm there we go.
You're not a full-time Zoom operator, Jacqueline.
Yes, I'm learning. Okay, so Emily, I think there has been a ton of cross-pollination that's happening. There's so many different facets to consider when approaching how we really need to be preparing our current and new buildings in response to this crazy pandemic. So I know during this process, Corgan has really blended a lot of our market sectors and just to really gather these insights. And we would really be interested to know how you have been working with the other teams and give us some perspective on how these sectors are learning from one another.
Yeah. So, I've been at Corgan for 13 years and we've always had market sectors and there's definitely been cross collaboration, but for the most part, we've, really been kind of focused on being experts in the field in what we know. And when this happened, it was this kind of crazy thing that happened where, credit to Samantha for really like bringing us all together through Hugo. But we all just kind of started talking and started learning things from each other. I think whenever you go through something like this, you need to be innovative and think of solutions that are maybe outside of your normal swim lane. And so, the information that we're going to be talking about today, it's not just our perspective. We've had a lot of collaboration, a lot of conference calls. I feel like I talk to these folks probably at least once a day, just keeping up with the learning. So it's been a really collaborative experience to learn from each other. And personally, I've learned a ton in the past few weeks.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Emily. Yeah, it's pretty insightful, and I've been a fly on the wall in some of those conversations as well, and just hearing the different perspectives and different approaches that you don't necessarily hear every day is definitely it's definitely beneficial, at least from my perspective. So I agree with you there. Okay, so I've got another $1 million question for you, Emily. I'm just going to pick on you this morning.
That's fine.
So here's a tough one. Everybody really wants to know how this is going to be impacting their real estate. So do you have any insight for us there?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that this is, like you said, the $1 million question, and probably the question that we get the most often. And I do think that there will potentially be some impact, but it's maybe a little too soon to tell. The way that we've been approaching this whole conversation is thinking about, kind of the near, the now, and the far, right? So in the near and the now, we're talking about enabling people to come back to work. I think as people come back and we start seeing human behaviors and what's developing, that might influence, potential square footage in the future. And then, I do think there will be more flexibility in the future. So we were already seeing before this happened, a trend towards companies being more flexible with their employees. It was honestly somewhat of a tension that we'd experienced with multiple clients of technology enables us to work from home, but we want people in the office because we know that's what's best for collaboration and community and engagement. And so how those things kind of balance out. So that's a very long answer to what sounds like such a simple question, but I think it's really going to vary by an organization really understanding what works best for them in the future, and who needs to be in the office, and how much space they really need.
Oh, that's a great answer. Okay, and really quickly, I just want to interject because we do have a couple late arrivals for the meeting. So as we're walking through this, if you guys have any questions for the panelists, please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll do our best to kind of work and answer those throughout the conversation. So thank you again. Okay, Matt, we're going to switch gears to you. Can you offer us a couple strategies on how design thinking can be brought to bear on near-term and longer-term realizations and outcomes?
You bet. You said the key word there, thinking, and that's what we're doing a lot of these days. So first of all, this is an unprecedented time. This is an unprecedented situation. We have not experienced anything like this in the modern world in quite some time. We're collecting data almost daily on a lot of these things. There's all sorts of things that we still don't know yet, like with the temperature shift and the seasonal changes. Is that going to have an impact on the spread of this thing and how this is going to continue to work? When we start putting people back in public places, is that going to have an impact, which we think it will? Boiling it down to what we're here to talk about today, more about how we enter and exit buildings, how we experience space, how we feel in these things together. And we'll look at questions like how are common spaces used? You've got lobbies, you've got gathering places, and all of these different kind of things where people will come together. As Emily said, there's a likelihood that we think on the front end, at least, there's going to be a lower occupancy rate, but we don't think the per person, it's not going to change the overall real estate aspect of this going forward. There are kind of three major tenets that we're using to guide our thought process here. The operational piece, which deals with the review of your janitorial practices. And the thing is, people want to see. I mean, normally, personally, I get frustrated when the restrooms close or when the break rooms close or something like that is not open because it's being cleaned and attended to at the time. Well, I think people are going to have a different attitude about that going back towards it. And I think seeing those visible actions taking place are going to make people feel better. You've got signage and information that you want to think about. I mean, there are guidelines that people want to talk about. People want to showcase what they've done to improve the building, what they are doing to keep space clean and orderly. And then there's some operational things that come into this as well, such like the security piece. We've heard of stories of folks controlling the number of people that can ride the elevators and those types of things. So the operational piece is the number one piece of this. The second piece is the physical aspect. This deals with space planning and things that you might be changing in your systems. Everything from touchless entry to potential nurses stations that are being implemented. One of the larger questions will evolve around, how buildings are perceived upon entry and arrival. Years ago, I designed a daycare center that had two lobbies, one for healthy kids and one for sick kids to wait while they were waiting for their parents to pick them up. I don't think we'll come to that extreme by any means, because people in the workplace aren't waiting for their parents generally. But it's one of those situations where I do think there will be a psychology that is implemented on some of these things. So I always say perception is 9/10 of the truth, and what people see and how they experience them are all pieces of this. But the third piece of all this is the legal aspect. It's the piece that not everybody is excited to talk about, but it comes down to the fundamental question: who is responsible for your health? The building owner? Is it your boss? Is it your organization as a whole? Is it you? And this goes to people in multi-tenant buildings and single-tenant buildings. All those questions are relevant. It gets into things like tenant rights. If the building owner deems it's not responsible to open a gym or a cafeteria, then are the tenants being denied rights? Are you opening yourself up to liability? So we're not here to give legal advice, but we're here to bring awareness to things that things that people do need to think about.
That's a great perspective. I hadn't even thought about that. And it sounds like there's a lot of different people who, especially on this call, that are probably in that boat and having to deal with those sorts of things right now, from an HR perspective and from a legality perspective. So yeah, that's definitely a whole change management conversation that could be happening. Perfect. Well, while we're talking about the workplace, Matt, could you give us a couple examples of how this practice could be? I mean, you mentioned building systems. I mean, there is the psychology aspect of it and the perception, but how could we tangibly shift or make changes within the actual infrastructure of the building to help, truly help this pandemic and people's situations?
Certainly, and I think we've got a couple of ways to look at that. There's the short-term immediate things that people can be doing, and that goes back to the visibility of some of the things that we talked about. We'll talk a little bit more about this later, but one of the concepts is this notion of implementation of systems and different filtration systems that go into the ventilation of buildings. That's the common kind of thread that is top of the concern list for everybody. Is we're recirculating air. What are the dangers? What are the challenges we're facing with this virus as it spreads through the air? A lot of these things overlap into, and Chris can talk about this a little bit as well, into the healthcare industry. A lot of the practices that we're seeing in healthcare facilities are going to migrate over into the workplace. We're going to see some different things, different custodial aspects, different filtration processes, a lot of those kind of physical things that will change how we think about buildings. Longer term, we're going to be looking at things like, again, back to filtration, but it's more about, is underfloor air going to come back? There's some studies now that say that is a more sanitary way of recirculating air. It's more efficient because you're not heating the whole space. You're not coming from the top down, from the bottom up. So you're not heating and cooling the entire volume of space. And also things like access to daylight. This is not a new trend, but it's something that people I think are going to be more leery or more excited to, and it's going to be a top priority of everybody. Even things like, an increased number of roof terraces, access to walking spaces, this nobility of taking breaks during the day and going and doing all these things. And, even things like parking garages and parking lots. I mean, that whole area and that transition from the outside to the inside is going to be something that people are all going to be reconsidering in a lot of different ways.
Mm-hmm. You've kind of set this new precedent now with people working remotely. They just want their outdoor access, right?
Indeed.
It's definitely going to make more spaces, or at least new spaces with outdoor access appealing for sure. So we're going to switch gears over. You mentioned the overlap between commercial and healthcare, and I kind of want to touch on that. And Chris, you are the expert in the healthcare world. So can you give us an idea of some of the healthcare principles that will be influencing the office moving forward?
Yeah, it has been interesting to see, like Matt mentioned earlier, and then we've kicked it off, that there's so many healthcare principles that we'll start seeing in all sorts of our building sectors, from, touchless screening that Sam will touch on later, to how do you get in and minimize those surfaces? Because we do know that the virus is mainly contracted and spread through the air. But there is the concern of that picking up some of that through touching surfaces and then touching your eyes and your nose and your mouth and all that. So some of the high level considerations will have to do with hygiene and cleanability and just that idea of clean and soiled. So if we talk about hygiene, some of the principles that we see in healthcare are usually there's a requirement, a code requirement, and even a operational requirement for hand washing sinks, as those are, just washing your hands with soap and water is still the gold standard to maintaining kind of that limited transfer. So if you think about those code standards, will we see more hand washing sinks and alcoves and commercial spaces that give people the opportunity to wash their hands? And just like Matt mentioned, perception is a big thing. So if you know that you see a hand washing sink in a place you're going, you know that people are probably more likely washing their hands and taking a more serious approach to cleanliness. And then there's also, that in the healthcare, even in a restroom or a patient room or an exam room, there's, along with the hand washing sink, you also see a foam in, foam out. So you're able to use a hand sanitizer when you enter a room, knowing that you're not going to bring something from the outside and in. And then when you're dealing with the patient, you're able to clean your hands and do it again on the way out. So there's just a level of comfort that you get about that. And then for our team, what we've been exploring and investigating is just the idea of cleanability and materials. In the first couple of weeks of this pandemic, you heard so many reports of you should use this, you should use that. So we've really taken the approach to see, and it's good advice that I got when I was younger, is to question everything. So you've got to ask, why are people saying this? Is it a sales thing? Is there science behind it? So what our team's been doing, and we're helping our other sectors understand, is, the language of the antis. What does antimicrobial mean? What are actually some of the surface considerations? Because we do know that, the studies have shown, and they've been documented during this process, that, plastic and stainless steel, the virus can live for about 3 days. So then, early on, copper was submitted as a solution that, cover everything in copper. All your high-touch surfaces should be copper. But we know that the virus also lives on the copper for 4 hours. So it's more of I guess the big takeaway for us, it's more of a system approach. You still have to be able to clean all of these high-touch surfaces. So and we know that, just standard cleaning methods like alcohol solution, hydrogen peroxide, and a bleach solution, if you're able to wipe down surfaces, that's really helpful. So when you look at your surfaces, look at those places that, think about an OR, there's cove ceilings, there's places where you don't accumulate dust and you're able to wipe down surfaces and really have a good account of a cleanliness. So that speaks to protocol, like Matt mentioned earlier with your housekeeping crew, that maybe there's a more expansive infection control plan that has to go along with this. And the last one is just, the idea of clean and soiled. In a hospital, there's different flows for how you bring sterile materials or sterile processes in, and then how do you get the dirty out? So if we do know that there's somebody who potentially could be infected, how do you give your cleaning crew the ability to go into a clean space, put on PPE, be able to take their card out, clean the space, be able to take that off, and have a trash area that holds that dirty supply. So those two flows don't ever cross-contaminate, and you're able to not introduce that back in.
Interesting. That's some great perspective. Thank you, Chris. And, we did get a question come through from Mr. Larry Kelso. He was curious, and I'm going to point this one to you, Chris, since you're the expert here. And he was interested in knowing if we've seen any considerations of UVC lighting happening throughout the space. If, are we going to be integrating that into as our normal standard moving forward?
Well, see, those are part of that, what I mentioned earlier, is part of your entire approach. So it depends on cost and the effectiveness of it. And I think there's always some strategies to do that, but we have to look at it as a whole system to see if that's an economical approach. And we have seen that. Matt will talk about that later. You've seen the that UV light and UVC light used. There's some processing time. So it depends on what spaces you're using. There's also some fumigation, using nebulized hydrogen peroxide, but it's like fogging. So you have to fog your space, let it sit, and then it's clean. But is that the right approach for a larger space? In healthcare, you see that usually in smaller spaces. And I know Sam can probably talk about this later, but aviation is also looking at ways and it's one of the leading edges. How do you clean a plane quickly and turn it around, that we'll learn from too?
Right. Well, this is a question. This is something that I've heard come up several times, and different strategies of how to kind of approach this cleanability. There was a comment here that said, how quickly do we believe these changes will be going into effect? And some companies are already returning to work, and they may be soon. So I've heard the strategy of this plexiglass divider between workstations to help mitigate virus transmission. Do these even work?
I think there needs to be more study on those. I know Emily and I have talked about that too in the past. Is that a perception thing too? Is that a first step that you incorporate to show that you care, but also it's part of a bigger system? So I know we've learned more about coughing and sneezing than we thought we would in the past 6 weeks. But knowing that a sneeze can travel 200 miles an hour and up to 27 feet, I mean, does the sneeze guard by itself help? Maybe in a smaller space when you can contain that sneeze, but even coughs, which have the droplets are larger and they fall to the floor quicker, there's still some spread that gets picked up by the space and the air moving. That there's some consideration. If you think about somebody vaping or a smoke model, if you blow that at a sneeze guard, it's still going to go around that to some extent. So does that just help you with that direct contact and hoping most of it with a mask and drop in the near term before we find a treatment for this? So it's interesting to see that. But that's again along the lines of we're questioning everything on the healthcare side because our clients are having to deal with treating well patients plus people who could have the virus. So even them, those clients are implementing new changes like you have to be masked, you have to be pre-screened, and some of that we may see in the commercial world as well.
Interesting. Thank you for that feedback. Okay, Lauren, we're going to switch gears over to you. With your expertise in well building design, can you shed some light on what we should be focusing on as far as changing or creating a healthier environment moving forward?
Sure, absolutely. So one of the first things that we like people to ask themselves or ask their companies internally, if you were going to check in with your employees and say, who is responsible for your health in the building, what would they say? Would they say environmental health and safety, HR, or maybe their own personal manager? I think any of those can be the right answer. The question is, do they have an answer? Do they know who that person is? And do they know who, from an organizational point of view, is looking after them? I know we've kind of talked a little bit about being comfortable and being confident for employees when they come back into the office, and knowing who is looking after them from a building systems point of view is going to be the first step in the right direction. Then the second question that we get a lot is, if you look at these wellness certification programs, so Well Building Standard or Fitwell, there are over 100 different strategies to impact health in the space. So which ones do you choose, and which one's right for your building and for your culture? If you were going to pick two, I would recommend focusing on filtration. That would be air filtration and water filtration. Get your building safe and healthy from the source at the beginning. And then the second step would be making sure that your cleaning policies are spot on. So as people are coming in and they're bringing their own bacteria or potentially their own viruses, that there's a second line of defense to get that cleaned up. And that layering process is what is going to be the right direction. Getting that foundation of filtration and cleaning protocols, and then digging into additional wellness strategies that match your culture. And in a minute here, I'll show a diagram that kind of digs into even more options for that from that perspective. One other thing that we've really looked a lot as we started to work with clients in their individual spaces, back to that kind of what works for your culture, is we have seen a little bit of tension between sustainability and wellness. For our industry, the architectural and interior design industry, over the last 20 years, there has been such a push for sustainability, which is fantastic. That sustainability for the earth has really been implemented into our designs, into the way that we fundamentally look at the workplace. Yet the wellness perspective, the sustainability for the people, hasn't really been layered in yet. Everybody's kind of been dipping their toe in and getting excited about it. But we've noticed as we have really started to engage in more and more wellness initiatives that there are some conflicts between wellness and sustainability that we want to pay attention to. A couple of examples of these would be in the restrooms. Should you go with hand dryers or paper towels? So from the sustainability point of view, we've had more of a push towards hand dryers, but evidence shows that paper towels remove more bacteria, but that's creating waste. So there's a little bit of a tension there in trying to determine what's the best approach. We've also seen the same kind of additional waste being created in food service areas. So where we've got cafeterias in the workplace or grab and goes in the workplace, we've moved a little bit more to a single serving option. And now thinking about, if we're going to be providing cutlery that's hand washed, thinking about the multiple touches of the cutleries or the dishware, and then thinking about, well, maybe we just want to be reactionary and make everything where it can be single service and tossed in the trash. We need to be working as an industry to figure out what that middle ground is. Ketchup, condiments, things on tables that are all shared. Is that going to want to go back to individual servings? And how can we find an appropriate approach that aligns with both our sustainability goals and our wellness goals? I don't think they have to be in conflict, but I think that we can work together with our industry partners to get the right fit and strategy. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on is building codes. So building codes, as we know, people are starting to already reemerge into the workplace, and those aren't going to be changing anytime soon. Hopefully, like we've seen on the sustainability end of things, where there has been influence of green design in building codes, we hope that we'll see that from a wellness point of view. But just simple things as coming back into the office and seeing a shared water fountain. I know I personally haven't used a public water fountain since like 1987, but they're still required. And so I think we're going to get questions about some of those things as our employees are coming back to work and seeing those and thinking, oh, that's unusual. They don't know all the code repercussions and whys. But Matt touched on that earlier. Maybe that's something from a signage point of view. We can add some signage to give some education or give some company input on how we think that they should be utilized in the space. So there's a lot to think about. But the great thing is there's a bunch of layered strategies that we can use to implement better wellness in the workplace.
Great answer, Lauren. Thank you. That's very informative. And it sounds like throughout that, there's also these kind of interwoven change management opportunities, like such as the signage. I mean, those sorts of things we need to be thinking about, that aren't necessarily things that designers can be controlling, but it's something that the facilities team and that our clients are needing to control. So, definitely thinking about those things is important. So Emily, I'm going to switch gears to you since you're the change management expert here. There's definitely been some discussion about this kind of idea of neighborhood zoning.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give us some insight on this planning strategy and elaborate on its potential benefits?
Yeah, so the idea behind neighborhood zoning is really just reducing the contact that people have with each other and with the spaces. So especially for tenants that are larger, what we're recommending right now, somebody had asked a question about how do we bring people back kind of now. So neighborhood strategy is a perfect example of this. So whether it be by floor or if you have large floor plates, maybe dividing it in two. And the idea behind a neighborhood is that it has everything that you need to function. So everything from a restroom to a break room to your desk to conference rooms. And then the people within that neighborhood only use that area. So at Corgan, we have several floors. So it might look like one floor is a neighborhood or maybe half of a floor is a neighborhood. So if I need to meet with somebody, I meet in my neighborhood. And I don't think that's how it's going to be forever, obviously, but that's a temporary thing. And it's both to help reduce those touch points, which we know is super important. And then the other thing I think it speaks to is the idea of confidence in going back into the workspace. Lauren used that word earlier, and I love that word for what our goal should all be right now, is to inspire confidence, because confidence is contagious, especially from a change management standpoint. If you can get your leaders on board, them showing that confidence and coming back to the workplace is huge. So while the neighborhood strategy is just good from a technical standpoint of disease spread, I think it also gives people an understanding of, if somebody does get infected, what's the plan here? You know, how will my neighborhood be shut down? How will somebody tell me? How will I be contacted? If we can communicate all of that transparently before people go back to work, I think it will go so far in just inspiring that confidence.
Yeah, it makes people feel more comfortable in the environment that they're in and who they're working for. So that's great advice. All right, Matt, this one's for you. You know, we kind of touched on the cleaning aspect, but I'm curious how this gets addressed into the actual infrastructure and the building design itself. Could you elaborate on that?
You bet. The common denominator, and just one of the things that we've all touched on, is this notion of ventilation. I mean, our buildings are conditioned with warm and cool air to keep us comfortable. We do this in a healthy manner where you're bringing in outside air, conditioning that air, and then recirculating it to a degree to keep from having to cool and warm it every single time you bring it in. So this notion of recirculating that air and conditioning it works on the efficiencies of the system overall. So one of the things we're looking at is how to improve that process. And some people have said, if that is in fact causing the spread of this disease, then maybe we should not recirculate this air. And that's not entirely a healthy idea either, because that doesn't allow the virus to dissipate. You're not bringing in fresh air. And so what happens is you're just keeping stagnant air in the building, which perpetuates the growth of these kinds of things. So there are a variety of different ways we can look at this, and this goes into filtration of the systems itself. One of the things that you can do is you clean the air, or you clean the particles itself. We've talked a little bit about UV light. This is a filtration system that can be brought into an existing system, implemented into a new system. What that does is that creates an opportunity for the coils that get where the reconditioned air comes through to be hit with intense UV light. This in turn doesn't impact airflow. It doesn't do anything negatively to the pressurization of the building, but it's an easy thing to be done. We've got a client right now that is, while we're all out of the office, they're implementing this system through their entire campus. And one of the great things about that is it's not something that anybody will actually see, but it's a PR and a communication tool for them. They can come back and tell everybody, like we talked about in the beginning. You can say, hey, look, while you were out, these are some of the great things we did to create a more healthy environment for you. So that you can debate the science of this all day long, but the truth is they're making efforts, they're showing, and hopefully be positive results in all of this. So that's a good thing. The other ways to look at this are how you filter the air. This virus particularly spreads on particulates that are floating around the air. And if you can filter those and minimize those particulates, then that is another effective strategy as well. There's a filtration grading system, and there's MERV, it's an acronym, and you go from 4 all the way up to 17, which would be something that you'd see in a healthcare opportunity or healthcare facility. And you can implement those to the physical filters that filter the air as it comes in and out of the system. The thing to be aware of here is that does have a potential to diminish the airflow as it comes in and out of the building. This could increase or decrease the amount of flow that gets to the spaces. It could require increased fan and energy usage. To some of the things Lauren was talking about earlier, this is a prime example of where wellness and energy sustainability come into a little bit of conflict with one another. So how do we mitigate those? But the overall approach is the more general, widely accepted approach is this notion of bringing in more outside fresh air. And this is done with a variety of things. And it depends a lot on climate and region and time of year and all of those things. But you can utilize things like economizers and that bring in unconditioned air that reduce the amount of the conditioning that is required depending on the time of year. So all of this needs to be balanced with ASHRAE and building codes and very green initiatives and those types of things. But those are some of the more widely accepted things that we're doing or that we're seeing to immediately retrofit some of the buildings and some of the things that can be done today. Also, and you can, if you plan for these things, they're relatively low cost and low impact to the system if you plan for them in the beginning. So I think that whole line of thinking, while not entirely cutting edge, is going to have a higher focus as we go forward to designing buildings and as we go forward with retrofitting and renovating existing buildings.
Makes total sense. Thank you, Matt. I want to toggle back real quickly to the Q&A. And Sam, I'm going to direct this question towards you. There were some thoughts or questions about, touchless processing. And I know that you have a lot of insight on smart building technologies come across in your research. Can you give us a couple examples how those tools can help us from a building management perspective?
Yeah, for sure. So, thankfully over the last few years, we've gotten really kind of close and comfortable with touchless processing. A lot of us open our own phones with our face, which means we don't have to type in a code. Sometimes when I don't have my makeup on, it doesn't recognize me. So, but we
Or a
can,
mask.
yeah. We've also gotten used to over the years with HelloFresh and Blue Apron, delivery straight to our door of goods. And those things also reduce our need to kind of get out and touch the things on the shelf for the groceries. So we've already been reconsidering our touch points throughout the last few years. It's only going to accelerate as we move through and past this time of crisis. And so when we think about our touch points within the built environment, within the workplace, we can start to think about, not only reducing them, but how do we keep that community and that engagement with our employees and our tenants and our staff members as well. So, one particular area that I don't want to see go away, but I definitely want to see transition is the whiteboard. That's a great place for us as architects and interior designers to collaborate. We all like to get up there and put our own ideas up on the board together. But, it is something where we're sharing markers, we're sharing a surface, we're standing really close to each other. So is there a way that we can move that to a surface or an iPad where we're collaborating and using our own surface, but throwing it up to a digital whiteboard? That would help to transition our collaboration spaces. We can also think about, the types of visitors that come to our buildings. We never know where they are before they come into our building, but we can actually manage the capacity of how many visitors are in the building at once. And we can do that through digital keys. So giving them access, to specific time periods when they can access the building. Not only that, but giving them specific access to different spaces throughout the building. Maybe we use what Emily was talking to you about the neighborhoods earlier, we give them access to a specific zone. So this would be a way to kind of manage, either hot desk employees that are only hot desking, or visitors coming in that are using hoteling spaces, or visitors that are coming in for meetings. And these digital keys don't need to have specific card keys or artifacts, but they can be accessed through your mobile phone. When we want to step that up a bit, what we see, have been seeing in the aviation world for several years is the use of biometrics. And we do see biometrics playing a large role in our workplace in future. Obviously that's not a short-term solution, it's more of a long-term solution. But giving our access points biometric access would actually completely reduce the touch point. And it would allow us to create, healthier buildings when we're using facial recognition, iris recognition, even sometimes voice recognition. Think about elevators. If we were able to shout out our elevator floor and not touch a control button, which is probably the most, dirty and germ-ridden piece of equipment in the office place. But, voice-activated elevators don't have to be just a response to COVID. They're actually really, really great devices for differently abled people as well. So a lot of these things that we're thinking through, we're not only thinking about them in our COVID lens, but we're also thinking about them in the lens of the environment post this era, because we're not going to be thinking about this disease for the rest of our lives. We may be, seeing effects of it, but it's going to go away from the top of mind at some point. And so again, when we're thinking about these touch points, we need to think about how they're going to interact with our day-to-day. So thinking in the cafeteria space, for example, introducing biometric pay or even a QR code scan from your mobile device, that would help us kind of reduce that touch point of, either paying by a kiosk or handing over your credit card or your ID badge or anything like that. So just removing those small instances of touch points would really, really help. And then, all of this can really be managed through the digital twin of a building. So for those of you that do know what a digital twin is, I'm really excited. And for those of you that may not, I just want to throw it out there that digital twin is really just the exact counterpart of the physical space, but in a virtual model. And so anything, it's by communication, anything that happens in the physical world, it shows up in the digital world. If you change something in the digital world, it shows up in the physical world. And we really think about this in terms, or in the past few years, we've been thinking about it in terms of proactive maintenance. That's really where this conversation has kind of lived. But what we see here is a real huge opportunity for us to engage with our visitors through wayfinding and sending them to the points of access that they have, with occupant and tenant management and tenant engagement tools. This is really where the digital twin can shine in this time, because we can think about it as, giving information transparency to the end user. You can constantly update your tenants and your staff members and your employees with air quality updates of the conference room they're about to walk into. When was the last time that was clean? What's that maintenance time frame? And who cleaned it, and how long did that cleaning take? You can let people know how many people were in the conference room before they got in there and who's expected to come in next. You could also do capacity control and allow people to see, okay, well, I know that there's 50 people max in the cafe and there's 45 people there now. I might wait a little bit to go down for lunch. So you can start to see how these user engagement tools can actually help, increase enhanced user behaviors when it comes to health and safety throughout the building. But they also might help. The digital twin can also help with crisis preparedness simulations. So this would help us to better understand how our neighborhoods, how the workplace, how the floor plan can adapt the environment to isolation if needed. So if someone is infected in the building, so it would help us, enact maintenance protocols and alert maintenance staff of which areas need to be cleaned. It could also immediately identify those neighborhoods, shut them down, alert occupants of changes in the building access, so giving them different exit routes, or giving visitors different entry points. And then all of this just means that there's no additional physical barriers that need to be put in place. It can all be accessed digitally. So, there's real excitement there of understanding how we can manage our buildings in a different way.
Hey, Sam, in response to all of that, I love all of this simple technology. It's not simple because it's so smart and there's so much science behind it, but the employee interface that you're talking about will be perceived pretty simply, voice activation on elevators, et cetera. And I love how that would just help complement some of the workplace wellness from a mental point of view, providing just less stress in the workplace. Whereas I think we need to be very cognizant of those barriers and putting them back to the plexiglass barrier at the workstation. What kind of anxiety would that provide to somebody, and sending the communication that this isn't safe for them to be there? That I love the layering of the technology from that point of view, from a mental wellness.
Yeah, and to your point, Lauren, if you went to a completely hot desking or hoteling situation, for those people that thrive on community and care, they care about their health, but they still want to be around people. They could understand where people are and know how to sit and engage appropriately. For those people that still want to be in the office but really don't want to be around people because they maybe have a little bit more fear, they can find those areas that are a little bit less occupied. And so this information transparency is really important, like you said, for the mental well-being of our tenants.
The other thing that I love that you said, Sam, was when you were talking about the voice activation and the gestural technology. I mean, just thinking about the future, generations that are coming into the workspace, I don't even see this as being optional. I mean, my 5-year-old knows how to order things off of Amazon using Alexa. So, in 20 years, when he's in an office space, he's going to be annoyed by the fact that he has to press a button to get up an elevator. So I do think that some of these things are already trends that we were seeing as being important. And I think COVID's kind of accelerating them, right?
Absolutely. Yes, everything that I just mentioned, these are trends that have been happening for years. We've seen, slow user adoption because there's a lot of like cost benefit that has to be analyzed. But when you think about the user behavior mindset and how user behavior can really shift which technologies are adopted or not, I mean, I always think, back to Google Glass. It was a great invention, but user adoption, users didn't want to adopt it because of the way it looked. So we have to think about, how that kind of plays out. And so I agree with you, Emily. COVID is actually going to be a catalyst for a lot of these emerging technologies, and it's going to move them forward in a lot of different ways. So it's really important for what we do on the Hugo team to make sure that while we're looking at these emerging technologies, we're also looking at the human behavioral shifts and where they're merging, and make sure that those are the areas that we're focusing on to see what's going to propel us forward in the workplace in the future.
Love that. Yeah. So you mentioned Hugo, and I don't know that everybody on the line is familiar with Hugo. So if could you give us, I know that you guys are doing some research right now, and there's a best practices report going out that you guys have been working on. Can you give us a little insight on that nugget?
Absolutely. So, one of the things that we do with Hugo is we learn from a lot of the expertise on all of the teams at Corgan. And this situation has really given us, like Emily kind of alluded to in the beginning, it's really given us the opportunity to work across all offices. Even our London and Singapore office have been a part of this best practices report that we're about to launch. We've worked across sectors. We've, really kind of reached out to outside collaborators as well. So, working with mechanical engineers, IEQ consultants, industrial hygienists, anthropologists, design researchers, and then even PhD students at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. All of us have been working together to create a best practices publication where we're identifying how we see our spaces that we design transition from aviation to data centers to interiors, workplace, education. We're looking at all different aspects. And one thing that we mentioned before is we're looking at, again, how human behaviors and emerging technologies are shifting. We're kind of identifying some of the gaps that we might see moving forward. But we talked about some of the emerging technologies that have already been seeing adoption over the past few years that are accelerating, but there's also human behaviors that have been, changing over the last few years that are now accelerating. So for one, we've been seeing a health resurgence over the past few years. I mean, Lauren spoke to a lot of it in the way that we design for mental wellness now. But I was mentioning HelloFresh as a joke, but I use HelloFresh all the time so that I can, cook semi-healthy meals and feel good about it. But it's better than going out to all the restaurants here in downtown, so that we're keeping a little bit being a little bit more budget conscious, and then also focusing on our health. But there's other things that we've seen. We've seen the personal reusable water bottle industry just skyrocket overnight to a multi-billion-dollar industry, because it's really important for people to not waste single-use plastics. And we've also, I mentioned we've been getting groceries delivered to our houses. We've just seen all of these trends happening in human behavior around health resurgence. Telehealth has been, a great indicator of where people are and how they're focusing on their health, and it has skyrocketed in this environment as well. And so we've been interviewing people during this time across the country to really understand, one, where their mental wellness and their health is focused, and two, what's going to make them feel comfortable and confident and safe going back into public spaces and public environments. And so we've been doing this, with a focus on the healthcare industry, and then also, understanding what that means for all of our market sectors. And so if you don't mind, I'd love to just share real quick, one thing that we're seeing that's a really big trend that we are diving into is the fact that the business traveler profile is changing. And that may not seem like it has a lot of impact on all of our market sectors, but it actually does, because when you think about it, we've gotten used to working from home over these past few months. And whether we want that to be our new normal or not, working from home will definitely be a trend that moves forward. We will not be 100% in the office all the time, because we now have capabilities to move around. And so we're seeing a lot of large companies start to invest in in more telecommunication technologies, more robust ones, and invest a little bit less in traveling for business, because we do realize now that there are certain things that we can do virtually. There's not that virtual barrier anymore, since we all have to work this way right now. And so because of the shifts in where financials are placed, we also see that this may change that day traveler profile, people that travel every day to go to a meeting in a different location. And what this means for the aviation industry is it's going to change the peak hour. It's going to change that 6 a.m. peak and that 6 p.m. peak, and it's going to change certain connecting flights. It may reduce the capacity or the flight frequency at certain cities. And so we're going to start seeing this transition into an emerging trend that has been happening over the last few years, which is called bleisure travel, which is business and leisure. What people used to do is they would travel on a Friday, spend the weekend on their business travel. Instead, we might see that spread out into a week where people are actually focusing on their wellness and taking wellness weeks as a part of their work from home strategy or their flexible work environment. So we definitely see this changing across all sectors, not just, one building alone or one building type, but all different types and all different types of people as well.
Thank you. That's wonderful. So insightful, Sam. I just want to pick into your brain all the time. I love what you guys are doing over there at Hugo. So, you mentioned the word community a couple times, and I feel like that's something that the office is starting to evolve into and starting to lure people back to the office. It's going to be more and more important for us to have that layer of community. So, Matt, this one's for you. I'm curious, because we've had some side conversations about this. If you foresee any sort of new building typologies evolving from this epidemic and how they'll translate into our current urban planning.
I want to key in on something that Sam and Emily were just talking about, this notion of this virus kind of accelerating some trends that we've already seen. I mean, a lot of these things aren't new, but what we have seen has been fascinating. I mean, it's one of those things where if you look at the spread rate on compared to other countries, America is arguably, it shot up a lot quicker. The number of cases were a lot greater, that type of thing. And I don't want to make this an American thing, but it's a human thing. But I think Americans also, we're extremely social creatures, and we're not intended to be caged animals. And I think you could count some of the American to arrogance and different things like that. But at the same time, it all goes back to the fact that we want to be around other people a lot or as often as possible. And being trapped in our homes, trapped in our apartments, trapped in our condo buildings, those types of things are antithetical to the way we want to live our lives. So I guarantee almost anybody on this call at some point in the last 8-10 weeks has gotten up and just out of frustration, gotten out of their house. They probably didn't drive, but they either got on their bike, they went for a walk, they went for a run, they got on a board, whatever, and went for a ride somewhere and got out of the house. Well, where did they go? They went to the street. And they went to the street, they went to the park, they went somewhere. But what that has done is activated our neighborhoods, it's activated our streets, and it's kind of brought in this mentality that, in my mind, kind of harkens back to the days before we had television and we wouldn't just go in our little caves and zero in on a screen and then come back out the next day. You're seeing neighbors you probably don't see regularly. You're meeting people you might not have met otherwise. People are interacting in ways that they weren't previously. So this means a heightened sense of security. This brings in the opportunity for maybe more of a walkability strategy in a lot of developments. Again, not a new idea, but I think after something like this, we're going to have a laser focus on a lot of these things that we've gotten used to. The live, work, play concept is not new by any means, but it's something that I think is going to have heightened scrutiny in a lot of things when it comes down to where tenants want to be, where buildings want to be, and how development happens as an overall strategy. I think is going to continue to evolve around this neighborhood model. It's going to be, everything from, as I touched on earlier, this notion of walking versus driving, and there could be a lesser diminishment or a diminished dependence on our cars. And some of our folks in the East Coast and in more urban areas, that's not a big deal for them anyway. But this notion of not having to commute everywhere and to be able to walk. We talked a little bit in some of our meetings about the break, as we're all at home right now, this break from home and work life. And now they're 13 seconds apart, where they used to be 20 minutes or an hour apart, where either your commute took you there or whatever, but now your personal and your professional lives are closely interwoven. The psychology of maybe breaking those a little bit, and whether that's in your car, what we've been doing, or if it becomes a walk. I mean, this notion of just be able to get outside and kind of decompress from one and prepare yourself for the other, I think are extremely valuable. And as a whole, how that starts to impact design, I think there's an endless number of possibilities of what this could mean, from, how cities are realized, how cities are planned, how zoning gets impacted. So I think there's going to be a lot of shifts in how we foresee the built environment in the coming years. I think we're all really excited about the opportunities. So should be fun to watch.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Matt. That's a great perspective. All right, guys, we've got about 5 minutes left, and I did want to ask this question for Lauren. And we do have several questions in the queue, the Q&A bucket. So if we don't get to your question today, we will certainly reach out to you guys and follow up with our thoughts there. So we really appreciate the engagement and the involvement that you guys have had. So Lauren, I know you mentioned earlier this graphic or this matrix that you were wanting to walk us through. Can you give us some insight on how this graphic can help navigate us on next steps?
Certainly. So let me pull it up here.
Sure.
So as I spoke about, creating that foundation of filtration and cleaning policies, our team has really had a comprehensive conversation of what types of things we should be implementing next. So we've created this matrix that evaluates high cost, low cost, high impact, and low impact, and broken it down into 5 different categories. And of course, this is just a model to start from. As we know, each building and interior office space is going to be coming at this from a different perspective, depending on whether or not you're in construction, you're out of construction, how old your building is, and then how it's set up. So the cost impact could obviously vary depending on those factors. However, back to that layering process, we're really advising people to look at this from a multifaceted perspective. Look at your building systems and operations. Are there a couple things in that bucket you could look at? Workplace enablement. How can you look at how your employees interact with the spaces you've designed? Cleanliness. The daily operational pieces. Is there something that you can implement from a touchless point of view, or just simple operations like how the mail is distributed? And then lastly, but most important, not most important, but mental and physical wellness. How does that get layered in? Maybe that's just looking at the behavioral aspect and thinking about how people are going to interact with that space, and how can you provide some education on that. I think Matt had mentioned this before. I think as our clients start to look at this, these touch points on this matrix, you'll notice that there's a handful of these you're probably already doing. That's going to be low-hanging fruit, easy wins for your organization. So maybe it's picking some of those and elevating them from a PR point of view internally, and then combining them with some new factors that you think might be able to increase the wellness in your space.
That's great, Lauren. Thank you. And I've got a couple notes here in the Q&A asking if they can have a copy of this matrix. So absolutely, everybody who is on the call today, we do anticipate sending out this cost versus impact graphic for reference. And we are certainly, willing to team up and have a call with you guys individually. If you want Lauren to kind of walk you through it in further detail, we're certainly able to do that. So. Okay, with that said, I am, thrilled at the amount of questions, and I wish that we could get to all of them, but we want to be respectful of everybody's time. So again, we'll follow up with our answers. And we really appreciate everybody's feedback today on the panel. You guys are amazing, and it's so great to hear all of the different perspectives, from the wellness to the built space to the healthcare view to research and development to change management. I mean, there's all these different facets that are happening, and it's just really great to see it kind of overlapping and turning into a successful, future way of thinking about workplace. So we appreciate your time today, and thank you again for everybody who's on the call, and hope you guys all have a wonderful day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Jacqueline.